Today we're going to be joined by Tonika Lewis Johnson with the Folded Map Project, Lolly Bowean, Media and Storytelling Program Officer with the Field Foundation, and Dr. Maya Green, Regional Clinical Director and Site Medical Director with Howard Brown's Health's 63rd Street Clinic. Quite a mouthful. In this session, we will discuss the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on people of color, along with the racial unrest stirred by the killing of George Floyd and countless others. They will be focusing on Chicago, where we had upswell last year, which is often called one of the most segregated cities in America due to its painful history of intentional segregation. With that, I will turn it over to Tonika, Lolly, and Maya.
Thank you, Dan, for that lovely, lovely introduction. And thank you too for acknowledging this land, which was first established by our Native brothers and sisters in your earlier introduction. And thank you for also acknowledging the enslaved Africans whose unpaid and often brutal labor built our country into what it is today. I'm Lolly Bowean, a writer and journalist in Chicago. I'm also the Media and Storytelling Program Officer at the Field Foundation. It is an honor to be here with you today. I was asked to come and give a framework for this conversation and to host this conversation. But I want to remind you, the audience, to please talk with us. Put your questions in the chat so we can hear them and understand what you're thinking about. Now we'll get started. By now, you all have heard the news. There was recently unrest here in Chicago. In the hours after a young man was shot by police on the South Side, dozens of people gathered in our city's famous shopping district, breaking windows, taking items out of the stores, and clashing with authorities downtown. The chaos played out on cell phone video footage that was shared across social media platforms. And it showed people running from police, cars ramming into storefronts, and people falling onto the ground while running and clutching armfuls of designer clothes, shoes, and items that they had grabbed. Like so many, I woke up on Monday morning and saw the national broadcasts recounting what had happened overnight, and I heard the statistics. More than 100 people arrested, 13 officers injured, and an incalculable amount of damage to our city's source of shopping pride, the Magnificent Mile. But there's also a story you are less likely to have heard. Long before those wee hours on Monday morning, Chicago was in a state of unrest. For weeks, there have been daily marches and protests across the south and west sides of our city, demanding a humane and urgent response to the uptick in violence. Nearly every day, there have been demonstrations protesting police misconduct and demanding accountability. And before this moment, before COVID-19 and the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and those related uprisings, there were scholars and activists, residents, organizers, and collectives of people who were demanding more equitable distribution of resources. There has long been a push for our leaders and decision makers here to not only see how communities have been devastated and disinvested in, but to do something to right that wrong. Today, we're here to talk about that story, the one that you are less likely to have heard about before. You see, even before COVID-19 struck and we ended up in this pandemic, in Chicago, studies showed us that if you lived in a zip code in the Black community, your life expectancy was about 30 years lower than your white counterparts who live across town. They have easier access to medical care, nutritious food, and educational and career resources. Now in this moment, so many of us are declaring ourselves anti-racist. We're reading the books and adopting the language. For some of us, we're realizing that this is just the start of a really long journey. For photographer, storyteller, griot, and all-around Inglewood advocate and investor, Tonika Lewis Johnson, the project that has become her life's work started with a simple story, a simple query. What would we see if we folded a map of Chicago in half and compared a single address on the South Side with its North Side counterpart? You see, the South Side is historically Black and brown, and the North Side is majority white and resourced. What she found with her research is a visual way of showing just how decades of engineered segregation and intentional neglect have dictated not only that our city is divided between race, but it is divided into the haves and the have-nots. Also joining us for this conversation is Dr. Maya Green, a physician who's based on the South Side and who's previously worked as an HIV specialist. She is the founder of HIV Real Talk. After completing medical school at the University of Illinois, Dr. Maya made a decision to focus her attention on health disparities in marginalized communities and brought her education back to the neighborhoods in Chicago that needed her most, the ones that are far away from the downtown hospitals and doctors' offices, and where residents struggle every day with the violence of poverty and inequity. In the Black and brown communities here in Chicago, Dr. Maya is known as a compassionate and trusted healer. She's doing the work of saving lives and helping residents save their own lives. I'm so glad to be in conversation with you both.
Thank you.
Because we're at this moment right after such dramatic uprising downtown, I feel that we need to start by talking about that destruction of retail property that took place. I don't want that to dominate our conversation, but I don't want to ignore it either. So Tonika, I was hoping that you could start by talking about the disparity that is revealed in the act alone, the fact that this took place in a different community with a different set of valuables, and that it is revealed that there is a different value system at play within communities, in different communities in our city.
Yeah, so the issue I have with the lootings occurring is the narrative around it. How it began, why it began. That's also something that I would like all of us to really sit and think about. How the looting, how it was connected to the shooting that occurred in Inglewood. How is that connection made? Just for us to get a little bit more curious on how stories and incidents that impact all of our city, how they're communicated to us. So that's just one level. But the incident itself of looting downtown, for me, it's symbolic. The city's response to downtown being looted, and quite frankly, it was not on as large of a scale as the previous lootings that occurred, but it still happened. But our city's response to that should also demonstrate the continued neglect that actually inspired or was the motivation behind the looting, which is our neighborhoods have been looted of the businesses and homeowners that tried and wanted to be a community. And there is a clear difference in how our city responds to downtown being looted as opposed to neighborhoods on the South and West Side being looted for decades of resources and wealth. And I think it's a great time for us to acknowledge that difference in how our city responds and not focus on condemning the looters. It has happened. Quite frankly, they're businesses, they have business insurance, it's going to get repaired. Let's use it as a teachable moment so we can understand why it happened and then how our city is responding to it. by condemning the looters and making a blanket assumption that Inglewood residents organized this looting. Like, this is part of the problem, perpetuating this horrible narrative about a certain part of the city.
And so, Tonika, you're pointing out that part of the blame that the city officials have made is that these were residents from a particular community that organized this sort of chaos to come downtown. But you've also pointed out that if they wanted to destroy property, they had to go downtown because that's where the city has invested the majority of its resources in preserving property. I saw you nodding, Dr. Maya. Do you want to chime in on this topic too and talk about it?
Definitely. Thank you. First, Lolly, thank you for the introduction. The part that I want to include in the introduction is how we all are needed and play a part in changing the narrative of our community and the work you do. And you know, a lot of times, like, your work is also in line with what Tonika is doing, also in line with what I'm doing, which is taking the true narrative that's being experienced by African Americans in Chicago and doing the work to get that narrative out there so that we can find solutions. So I'd like to thank you for that. So also, to dovetail off of what Tonika is saying, we have to look at how many times advances or any action is taken and put in a narrative of blame. You know, I'm always, this time, George Floyd, Trayvon, you can name it. I'm always taken aback by how connecting African Americans to blame, even though in the last protest we saw other cultures, other ethnicities besides African Americans blowing up stuff, setting stuff on fire. They found the person that set fire to that restaurant and still blamed African Americans, even though they were caught on tape doing it. You know, and the focus. So right now, countless African Americans are losing their lives in an untimely manner, an unjust manner, in a manner that's historically unaccounted for. And the focus is things. You know, I'm always shocked about that. I'm always shocked, well, and frankly disappointed. So I think a lot of times, like, we focus on things, and we need to focus on these lives lost. You know, we need to focus on these lives lost and stop normalizing the loss of African Americans. You know, and so we don't want to see the community blamed. We don't want to see that. We want to see restoration. We want to see reconciliation, and we want to see acknowledgement of the things that sometimes pressure people to these points, but also we don't want to make that connection, like, this happened in Inglewood, so therefore this is happening downtown, this is happening north, this is happening, you know, and look historically, even we can trace it back to the Tea Party, right? You know, look at how that was viewed versus the Boston Tea Party. Look how that was viewed versus, you know, the way land is gotten, the way lives are taken, the way businesses and money and all that has historically been taken in America. And when one culture that's not typically white does it, look at the narrative on that. Yeah. So you know, sorry, I don't want to take up too much. Yeah.
No. So I think that's a great point, that if you look at that historical reference of destruction of property with the Tea Party, that was something that was celebrated and kind of looked at as the foundation of American revolution and American freedom. But when it comes to African Americans destroying property in an attempt to get attention to the historic inequities, it's not viewed in the same light. To shift a little bit, because what you talk about is, Dr. Maya, the value of property versus the value of life. We've seen some of that play itself out as a result of this pandemic. We know that COVID-19 has really shaken the Black community in Chicago, in that African Americans account for 52% of the confirmed cases, and that African Americans and our Latinx brothers and sisters are the majority of deaths from this pandemic. Can you talk about the sort of systemic reasons, that it's not genetic, that there is a historical, systemic racism at play, which has caused this disparity in numbers.
Yeah, I think you talked about it some when you talked about Tonika's work. You talked about it when you talked about the stats of Inglewood life versus Streeterville life. Streeterville being the north side for the people that don't live in Chicago. Streeterville is the north side and Inglewood is on the south side of Chicago. And the span of life being 30 years less on the south side. And you're right, it's not genetic, you know, and we do want to point out that these things are not also just related to COVID. These are things that are ingrained in our society, right? So I always use this example. You can talk about COVID, we can talk about Hep C, and I always mention Hep C because now there's a cure for it. So if someone's living with Hep C, they can take medicine and it will be treated. HIV, diabetes, high blood pressure, we can go on and on and on, right? If we cut off, if this is a tree, these are the branches, right? This is the bark, and then the roots are down here. We can cut off that Hep C branch, right? Because there's a cure. This tree will grow another branch because the problem isn't the branches up here. It's not COVID or any of these other things. The stuff is down in the root, and that's inequity and social determinants of health and the racism, right? And so even if you look and we take that and we apply it to COVID, the way the algorithm rolled out, and the algorithm is something that we in the medical industry use to determine what's going to be our course of care. So when it first hit the United States, they said, oh, you have to have travel to these specific countries, you know, and, you know, I don't want to design this like African Americans or Black people don't travel. Because we certainly do. Do we historically travel more to those countries that were on that list whereby which you get a COVID test? And the answer to that is no, right? So you have to have traveled to those countries in order to get it. Then they said, hey, the test is limited in resource, and limited in resource in our country historically means the South side, the African Americans won't, and Latinx people won't get it, or they get it last, you know? And so limited resource means increased barriers to African American people. And so they put it, if we look at when the tents open or where the tents open on the south side of Chicago, they put them in the medical district and on the north side. And even I've seen people, so when we talk about racism in healthcare, I've seen people that come for a test for COVID that went to the north side, not once, not twice, but 3 times, and we're told they didn't need a test, even though their age, their health background mentioned it, and we test them, and then we end up seeing them in the ICU. So even in the way we create the algorithms, it's implicit bias, and that bias relates to decreased or worse outcomes in the African American community. And it's not just COVID, it's historic, and COVID just ripped the Band-Aid off of what, you know, what's going on, what's really going on.
Yeah, so and once the narrative around COVID initially hit our city, the testing centers were opened and it was prioritized once again to the north side, the white and resource communities versus communities of color. So we were finding out and getting opportunities to be tested even later than our counterparts, which means that we sought medical treatment at a later state. Now, speaking of those disparities, Tonika, your project in your life's work has revealed to us how we ended up in this system of inequity, how we ended up in a segregated system. Can you talk about just what your research has showed of how segregation has been engineered?
Yes, so I like to refer to folded map as an easy entree into understanding systemic racism and how it plays out in our present day lives. And so with folded map, I wanted to be able to show the undeniable difference, but also to make a connection to the social network, the human aspect. Because we live in Chicago and we're frustrated at the fact that it's segregated, but we haven't made the personal connection that it's talking about us, you all. Like, it's literally talking about the decisions we make or the choices that are put in front of us to make decisions on where we're gonna live and so forth. And so I really wanted to bring out not only just the history of segregation, but how and why it's continued. It's not just continued because of policies, because we've had policies put in place to dismantle it, and it hasn't worked. And the reason it has not worked and the reason it won't work is because the thoughts, the stereotypes is what's systemic. And you cannot change that with a law. You can only change that with a conversation and getting to know people. But how do you get to know different people in a city so segregated? And so I really wanted to help people or provide them with a model of how you can connect and talk to people who live on the South Side and you live on the North Side, or you live on the North Side and work on the South Side. Like, you have to be intentional about your social network now. It's become that serious that you cannot live and stay in your bubble, both sides. And a lot of people have misinterpreted my Folded Map project to mean, oh, you just want to get North Siders to understand the inequity on the South Side. No, 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 no. Because that's why I tell the origin story of Folded Map, because that is how I, as a little Black girl from Inglewood, going to high school at 13 on the North Side, that is how I was exposed to what I'm entitled to as a resident. It opened me up to questioning, why doesn't my neighborhood have this? So I also want Southsiders to be able to see, and Westsiders to be able to see the neighborhoods that are over-resourced and to begin to question why. But it all comes down to understanding how this historic system of racism has seeped into our thinking. And it goes back to the blame. You know, we are all guilty of assigning blame to Black people, to young Black people of a specific age group. And we can't create any change if we don't try to address the thoughts, the stereotypes. That's what's been passed down. And so I just feel that now is just a great time for all of us to continue the conversation of, how do we interact with each other? How do we talk to each other? How do we listen? How do we listen to each other?
Yes, what a wonderful point, Tonika. You talk about, you've packed a lot in that statement and in your project, but you talk about the stereotypes. One of the stereotypes that has continued to be perpetuated in the medical industry is that African Americans have a higher tolerance for pain. And so as a result, when Black people go to the doctor, when they go to the hospital, there's symptoms that they complain about. When we say that we are in pain, when we say that we're hurting, it's so often dismissed. Dr. Maya, can you talk about how that essentially leads to the impact and the effects that we've seen from what Keonga Yamada Taylor calls the Black Plague, COVID-19, that when Black people went to the hospital and sought help, they were turned away?
Yeah. So I mentioned earlier that I had been seeing patients that would be turned away 3 or 4 times. They end up in the ICU, not going to the hospital, going to the emergency room, being admitted on a regular floor for stabilization. They end up in an intensive care unit. And that speaks to not only pain, but shortness of breath. So symptoms, historically, when African Americans go into a medical area and they complain of them, they historically get seen or downgraded or downplayed, things like that. And, you know, it ties into a lot of things that all 3 of us have at some point in our life had conversations with each other about. You're a strong Black woman, strong Black man, and we may be strong, but also we are of the mind to articulate what we're experiencing. So that ties into the narrative of, I'm in a space articulating to someone in medicine, or let's look at what's happening in law, and let's look at what's happening for our protection and service people, when I'm articulating something and it gets interpreted in a way that they can deal with, so that's where the neglect of history of pain comes. And so then I want to also tie it into something else, because there's a lot on my mind. I'm trying to put it all in. when we say, oh, Black people don't come to the doctor, well, historically, look what's happening when we go and we tell you we're in pain, when we go and we tell you we're having it, these symptoms, and not only historical. Currently, when we go and we're saying, I'm having shortness of breath, look what's happening. So like Tonika said, we have to tie that into not the narrative of African Americans and their distrust in the health industry. We have to acknowledge the lack of trustworthiness of the health industry to African Americans. And so change that narrative and start to talk about that. It's still here, it's real, and it is part of what's causing the Black plague, because we know. So here's the other thing that's on that thing. We attend these weekly calls and they talk about Chicago and the factors: high blood pressure, diabetes, asthma, all elevated in African American communities because of historical neglect, right? And disinvestment and things like that. But also they're on the list of things that put someone at risk. So when we first recognize our bias and then take steps to mitigate that bias, it would tell us to open up the testing centers on the South and West Side. So open up the testing centers in neighborhoods historically, that even if we didn't want to tie it to race or anything like that, we could tie it to diagnosis of these things. The other thing that's on that list, that's the highest risk factor, is lack of access to nutrition. And so that's why we have to support organizations that necessarily aren't in the business of buying into talking about it over and over again, because we can do millions of studies. I can do studies on racial inequity until, the cows come home, until we implement action to undo this inequity. Organizations like RAGE, the Residents of Greater Englewood, and organizations like that are delivering food. Let's do something about it. Let's not also say, hey, there's lack of nutrition. Let's get that nutrition to the community and establish things to mitigate that. This kind of behavior and what Tonika talked about goes back to the movie, The Birth of a Nation, where when African Americans were becoming a force to be reckoned with in this country, the narrative was designed to say, when you see an African American running, fear them. When you see an African American in your space, they're up to something. And we have carried that narrative throughout the ages in this country. And that's what's playing out in COVID. That's what's playing out in the blame of who's looting and how they're looting and things like that. When even today, we have organizations that call themselves the Tea Party. They celebrate what happened with an organization that wasn't African Americans years ago, and they celebrated with pride. Now, when other African Americans do it, it's taken back to that blame. It's taken back to low self-worth, ill intent, not being Yeah, and even look at the situation that happened Sunday, where the witnesses and the people involved are saying, hey, the narrative that's going out is not exactly what happened. I was there. That's not what happened. And still, we're like, oh, someone fired at the police in Inglewood, and as a result, all this chaos. No, all this chaos was here before we got here, and we were never the author of this kind of chaos in this country.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, no, you've said so much, Dr. Maya, but particularly I want to zero in on some of what you've touched on, which has made the African American community in Chicago so vulnerable to COVID-19, and this touches on the work that Tonika has done. One, African Americans tend to work the jobs that limit our ability to actually quarantine. Right. So, and there's this historical inequity that we tend to be in the work that is considered essential. So we're there on the front lines in jobs that also put us at risk. We tend to live in housing and in communities that are a little more crowded, that are shared and communal, but that also puts us at risk. So if Paul comes home from his job and he's picked up the COVID germs or the coronavirus, then he's more likely to spread it within the household. We don't work those jobs where most of us can just stay at home and stay in the house. We're also limited to access to healthcare. And Dr. Meyer, you touched upon having the limited access to grocery stores. So knowing these things, knowing that this disparity already existed, in many ways we knew in advance that a pandemic was going to impact the Black community and the Latinx community in a harsher fashion. It forces us to then question whether we actually care, right? Tonika, in your work, you have looked at the difference between African American community on the South Side and its counterparts on the white North Side. Sometimes people think that that is a call for more movie theaters, or that it's a call for more restaurants with outdoor seating, right? But this is not just about amenities. This is about life and death. Can you talk about what your project has shown regarding access to grocery stores, regarding access to a doctor, regarding access to a dentist?
Yes, it just shows historic neglect. And not only neglect, but an erasure of care to a huge portion of the city. And this is where it becomes even irresponsible. It's like I'm just gonna call it fear and hate. The fear and hate and in consideration of Black communities in Chicago is so prevalent that they will go against what makes logical business sense as a city, which is Southside is 60% of your city. But you still choose to not invest in making the amenities available to the residents on the South Side that will still improve your city overall. You have 60% of the city that does not have the amenities that would increase the property values, that would encourage people to want to purchase homes in these neighborhoods. You are so neglectful as a city historically that you're removing the opportunity for that kind of market to emerge on the South Side. And for what? So these things that would have helped people prevent or become just well equipped to build their immune system to fight something like this pandemic, which is healthy food, which is access to health, which is access to places where they can work out. If we had all of those things in place, like I was saying before, those are amenities that increase the property value or increase the value of a neighborhood, and also removes the dire situation that a lot of people are in these neighborhoods by giving them access to places they can work, to activities that youth can do. And so that will automatically minimize the crime that we see. So it's just like when you start adding it together, like this investment will create solutions and eventually minimize crime and violence that we become known for. You have to question why is there no investment? And so that's what Folded Map and then the other extension projects, like Don't Go to the South Side, where I'm literally talking to people who have been told to not go to Chicago's South or West Side. And they're predominantly white, but they're also people who are Black and of other races, but are transplants. And when you have that kind of narrative going on to this day, it does influence what is not invested in these neighborhoods. And so that is what I'm hoping that my work will be able to help be a tool for people to really face the fact that it's illogical in a business sense, this lack of investment. So it still comes down to racism.
And so it causes pain for us all, this segregation. And when people are told not to come and visit the South Side, then what do you think they're told about possibly investing in this community? And so it doesn't just deprive the historic African American community in Chicago, it deprives our city as a whole. It stops our city as a whole from being prosperous. I think that's such a wonderful point, Tonika. I want to point out too something that I shared in the chat. This morning, the New York Times put out a opinion piece, and it said that if Black people were immune to coronavirus, our mortality rate in 2020 would still surpass our white counterparts. And that's in part because of the segregated medical system, because of the inadequate access to health care, and quite frankly, the historic distrust between African Americans and the medical system that has tortured us, that has neglected us and abused us. There was a question that came up from Kathy Gale in our audience that I want to pose to you, Dr. Green. Do you think in medical school, as a person who's gone to a mainstream state medical college, do you think that it could be taught to medical doctors compassion and the better improved treatment of African American communities? Or do you think this is something that has to be legislated in order to improve the health and the health outcomes of Black communities?
I said this too, and I think Tonika touched on it earlier. It's one thing to have legislature, right? We had legislature that African Americans were no longer slaves. Then we had to have legislature to say, oh, 50, you can't treat them like slaves. Now we have to have legislature to, and so it's one thing, and I'm not saying that's not important. What I'm saying is it is the teaching, but it doesn't start in medical school. It starts when we're young. It starts when you get the doll that's African American and you see all of your friends who are African Americans playing with the blonde hair like Barbie. It starts when you turn on your TV and you don't see, African American people or people of your culture being deemed as intelligent, smart, beautiful. It starts when you go to school, you go to college and people tell you, oh, you're smart for a Black person, or, it starts in those things. It starts at the dinner table, and that's where it starts. By the time we go to medical school, we're already formative thinkers, and we have, and the bias goes so deep, whether you're African American or not, right? And the bias goes so deep in all of us. I think, what's her name? Dr. Joy DeGruy. She wrote Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. The bias goes so deep within all of us that by the time it goes to medical school, you look around and your professors are white. Your teachers are white. The professors are white. The models are, the books you read are written by white people, and literally in books, they talk about the size of a brain by ethnicity. I think they took it out now, but I went to medical school in 2003, and they still had little statements like that they had to take out of books. So it's so ingrained in our society. By the time we enter into medical school, it's all around us. So we need to really think about how we're going to undo that. Like Tonika said, we need action. The thing about being born into this kind of system is it impacts all of us, no matter what our background is. And the only way to undo implicit structural racism is to insert equity at every age, preschool, when you're born. Look at the stats from the time you are born Black. Your mortality rate is higher trying to come out the birth canal, and so there's no surprise that years later, Streeterville and Inglewood are having, that disproportionate number in years of life. We had it coming out the birth canal. The mortality of Black babies is way higher than the mortality of our white counterparts. And so the only way to do that is to insert it at the school level: birth, school, work, education. We have to insert equity at every level, in every aspect, in the love aspect, and what we think we deserve in love, mental health, spirituality. We go to spirituality. We read, a lot of my, we were talking about reading books that say spiritually, here's the description of the person you believe in. And then when you draw it, they don't match that description. All of that is the implicit, all of that is the insidious way racism works in this country. I don't want to take up all the time talking about it. You know, I can go on, but yeah.
No, you bring up a really good point about the insidious way that it creeps into our psychology and how that turns into behaviors. And so the project that I'm really excited that I was able to actually make progress on during the pandemic, the Don't Go to the South or West Side project, that's the tentative title. I was able to speak to a lot of young and older white people who I asked them the question of, when were you told to not go to the South or West Side? And how long did it take you to like eventually go? And what I consistently heard as they were explaining those answers is it really was just is fear. And they had to trace back the unconscious and conscious moments of when that fear of the South or West Side was instilled in them. And it always came back down to their family. And so I am hoping that my project will provide another tool for our white allies to understand that how they came to have the implicit biases that they have, providing a platform for them to talk about it, because their psychology also contributes to the perpetuation of everything that we are trying to dismantle. And it's gonna come down to them having them hard conversations with grandma or their uncle that was a police officer, or their family member that got mad or scared for them when they got off the expressway on 63rd Street. You know, they're going to have those difficult conversations and reconcile the fact that they have been taught to be racist. And acknowledging that is part of the healing. And also for us as people of color to recognize how difficult that is as a white person. Like they're literally, you know, have to acknowledge the fact that they've been taught to think these stereotypes, and then they got to argue with their family, which is what we need them to do because we don't have access to those conversations. And so I just think that we all need to be more vulnerable and honest about how racism and the systemic insidious nature of stereotypes and biases has impacted us today. And people of color, we talk about colorism all the time, but now we need our white counterparts to come to the table and y'all talk about how being segregated from us, how that has contributed to what you think about us, and then also how you feel like your home is homogenous, like your bubble. You feel like you are missing out on some connectivity to the larger world. And we just have to create project spaces where we can have these conversations.
Yes, and I'm so grateful that your project Folded Map has forced many of us to have those conversations here in Chicago. Tonika, I want to go back to just give some information and touch upon what Dr. Maya was telling us earlier about coming in contact with physicians in attacking and dismantling racism in medical school. First of all, Black people make up 13% of this country's population, but only 5% of the physicians. So we have to have some crossing of the line, so to speak, because the majority of African Americans are going to come in contact with white doctors if we're seeking medical care. And there has to be a level of compassion that is displayed there. I also feel compelled to share this quote. I was on a panel this weekend with Dr. Williams from Harvard Medical School, and he shared this quote from W.E.B. Du Bois that was back in 1967. And he said, 1899, he says, the most difficult social problem in the matter of Negro health is the peculiar attitude of this nation toward the well-being of the race. There have been few other cases in the history of civilized peoples where human suffering has been viewed with such peculiar indifference. And so that kind of touches upon what you were saying, Tonika, too, that unless there is an uprising like what we saw on Monday that takes it, the fight, the struggle, the battle outside of our community, then so many times our counterparts won't engage in the work of dismantling, the very uncomfortable work. And we need our counterparts to not only be engaged in the work, but to do the work because it's the foundation of what they're doing. Let's talk a little bit, and I want to give a little plug to, if you want to know a little bit more about the historical context of how we got here as a country, there's a new book out by Isabel Wilkerson, another daughter of Chicago. We claim her here, called Caste. It really outlines historically how we got to this collective racist system that reflexively we automatically think Black community equals poor, although the majority of poor people in this country are white, right? Why we automatically, reflexively think of Black communities as being neglected and deserving of neglect, right? And so she kind of unpacks a lot of that. But Dr. Maya, I want to turn to you because whenever we have these conversations, people want to know, what can I do? Where do I enter and where do I start? And so I'm going to shift that to you, Dr. Maya, and then I'm going to push it over to you, Tonika. They're telling us that we have a little bit more time.
Okay. Ooh, you said so much that I kind of wanted to address, but I'm gonna stay right here. Try to insert it into my. I think we start at our own dinner tables. I think we start not only at our own, but interconnecting in spaces like this, and also moving forward. Right. The only way historically, the way this country works, the only way to undo that racism we see by the time you see that 5% of physicians are Black. The only way you can undo that is to encourage more people to become physicians, encourage more people to become writers, and encourage more people to become art, like encourage more Black people in those spaces, but also as on the side of people who admit people to college and things like that, we have to undo the racist kind of barriers. So, I mean, that's the only way to do it, is to move into those spaces. But I used to be a teacher, and I used to teach at Carver Middle and Allgale Gardens, right? When the kids were told that they couldn't do it, they believed it. But when the kids grew up thinking they could, they also believed that, and so having the conversation with our kids, having those expectations of our kids, also challenging kind of the narrative. When people want to talk to me about Black on Black crime, I'm like, well, we talk about that all the time. Tell me your stats on white crime. You don't know them. They're not even a topic to you. But Black on Black crime is plastered all over the news. Also, like you said, stop normalizing Black trauma. So coming into spaces when we have the opportunity and saying, stop, I see this, and this doesn't feel right. This feels like this, and opening up the doors like Tonika is doing for those conversations. Because the truth is, what Tonika is doing is transformative, because it's hard for all of us to have those conversations. It's hard for people to acknowledge a part of them. We as a country to acknowledge a part of us that we want to pretend doesn't exist. So we're busy trying to pretend that it doesn't exist. And if Tonika was uncomfortable having the conversation, think about the millions of people Tonika has already reached. Those people would also not have the opportunity to have those conversations. So I think changing the narrative. The other thing, because we only have a lot of limited number of time, we talked about before all this money that's being put into transformative equity, right? This money has to go to people of the descendants of Africa, the descendants of our indigenous Native Americans, because other people don't know how to heal us. The answers to our community are going to come within us. So we have to also be intentional about where we're putting those dollars, because that is actually one of the major points or factors that contribute to healthcare. Actual healthcare includes transfer of wealth. Not me writing medicine in the clinic once you already got something. It's transfer of wealth. And until we're ready to do that work, we're not ready as a country to step into equity.
I mean, Dr. Maya said it all. And, the only thing I'd like to add is just continue to be curious. Change doesn't have to be you just only donating or you just volunteering or you protesting. No, like it can also include remaining curious, continuing to learn and listen. Learn to listen. And the only way that you can learn to listen is if you remain curious and to know that it's things you don't know. It's things that you have been taught. And now it's time to just reflect and introspect and be introspective and question all of those things that you have been taught that could have made you think a specific thing about a group of people, a location, a geography, and challenge that and question it and get to know people who are different than you in an authentic way. Find a shared passion with people, and you will definitely see people from different lived experiences. So we have to accept the fact that we live in a diverse world, a diverse city, and we have to interconnect. We just have to. We need each other as allies and to learn from each other. That is the only way we're going to push this forward. And this kind of space is perfect for it. You and I are exposed to people that we probably wouldn't come in contact with any other way. And this is the only way that they're going to hear our perspective. So just continue to listen and learn. Use social media. I think that's an easy action. It doesn't feel like it's much, but trust. There is power in continuing to learn and use social media as a way to connect to people.
Yes, thank you so much, Tonika. What you said reminds me of one of my favorite scholars, historians, and pop icons, Rihanna, who says, if you want to break bread with us, when you see us dismantling, when you see us fighting, when you see us pushing against the system and the status quo, pull up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is great. Yep.
Thank you so much I want to just shout out a couple people in the chat. Jen, who has been just giving us love this entire time and sending affirmations. Thank you, Kathy Rollman, for your support. And Zelma Zabala, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name. Abby Rowland wants to know if the links, I put some links in the chat, if they'll be available. Hopefully the host will share those. I'll definitely share them on social media. This is just the beginning of a conversation. It doesn't have to end. Follow Tonika Johnson on Twitter, follow her on Instagram and learn about the work that she's doing, and continue to be in conversation with Upswell and Independent Sector. Thank you so much for having us. This has been a gift for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you.